Today we are going to talk about Unit 7, and that's about reincarnation and mediumship. Okay, so everybody raise your hand who wants a good punch in the nose. Or instead of a punch in the nose, how about a good hard slap in the face? Anyone? No? Well, here's why I bring that up. About 7 or 8 years ago, I started making a lot of progress and started discovering things that just didn't seem to fit with what I understood to be reasonable according to science. And I got to the point where I felt like I needed something to really shock me into accepting that this stuff was real. I needed something that was blatant, it was undeniable, and essentially a hard punch in the nose. I needed something to really get my attention. So what I started to do was, at that point, I was pretty familiar with the range of phenomena that I guess we'll just sort of all lump into the basket of paranormal or perhaps metaphysical. And we've talked about. I've given lists of what that includes. Everything from astral travel to mediumship, lucid dreaming, et cetera, et cetera. There's a big long list. But the idea was to see, some of these phenomena are relatively easy to deny and easy to argue against because most of them almost all of them lack physical evidence. Believe it or not, there's one or two that actually have physical evidence that we'll talk about at some point. But the idea was I needed to find something that was really compelling. And it only needed to be compelling for me personally because I really felt like I needed to get over the hurdle, to get over the hump of believing whether there really truly is a non-physical aspect to our reality. And until I got to that point, I was constantly going to be wrestling with that issue. Imagine, just for example, wanting to learn more about and get into the details of the effort to land humans on Mars. Elon Musk is convinced we're going to do that in less than 10 years, and he developed a set of reusable rockets and is currently flying missions to the space station to deliver goods, and shortly will be delivering actual people to the space station. But imagine trying to sort of research this and understand this and discuss this, but the people you want to discuss it with don't even believe that man landed on the moon, right? And there are a lot of deniers out there that believe we have not landed on the moon, and they point to all sorts of evidence that they believe is valid. But the idea here is, if what you're trying to do is discuss something like landing humans on Mars with people who won't even concede that we've landed on the moon, you're never going to get to the actual work at hand. You're never going to get to the issues that you want to get to if you can't even get over some basic fundamental sort of assumptions. And assumptions is a bad word because I'm not assuming we landed on the moon. I think it's a proven fact. But you need to acknowledge those proven facts so that you can move beyond them and really get to the meat of the matter. In that case, it's Mars exploration. So how does that apply here? Well, the way this applies here is if I can't even get over the fact that there is a non-physical aspect to reality, how could I possibly get to the real meat of how reality is actually constructed and how this all works? So you got to move beyond certain things so that you can get to the important things that you really want to look at. So to get back to my basic idea is I needed to find a phenomenon that was going to do that for me. And after a bunch of work and research and lists, etc., I really came up with a couple. And one of them was mediumship, and the other was reincarnation. There are many, many cases of both of these things, many examples of both of these things. Quite a few more of mediumship than reincarnation, but lots and lots of evidence, lots of study. But I ended up deciding that reincarnation was the way to go, and here are the reasons why. First of all, most reincarnation stories involve young children. I'm talking about kids that are as young as 2 years old. I mean, barely to the point of being able to speak. And the beautiful thing about getting evidence from young children is they don't really have an axe to grind. They're not trying to make money. They're not trying to be famous. Yes, of course, they might want some attention, but in the big scheme of things, the most innocent people you could find with the most sort of straightforward and honest motivation would be a young child. I think we can all agree with that. So there's that whole aspect of it, and it turns out that almost everyone who really does talk in detail about a reincarnation story involving themselves are almost all children. And for reasons we'll get into, you don't really find adults that involved in it from a first person perspective. Also, there's something very interesting about reincarnation. That is, there's a lot of detail that the original incarnate, the original person knew, a lot of information that person knew, that is now lost because that person, in almost all cases, and there are some really weird cases where the person's still alive, but in almost all cases, that original person is dead. And so all of that information, all those memories, all those experiences were buried with them. It's kind of like the story that I told in a previous unit involving the two brothers and the baseball. And the brother who knew where the baseball was dead. The medium didn't know anything about the baseball. The brother who was still alive knew about the baseball but didn't realize where it was. And so we're talking about information that is not available to anybody, but somehow it is still available. So I was really comparing mediumship and reincarnation. I really felt like reincarnation, first of all, because it involved young children, and second of all, because it involved so much veridical information, so much information that we could use to fact check, that reincarnation would be the best way to go. Now, I really decided, I guess even before I started looking to it in great detail, that if I were able to accept that reincarnation existed, I would have to accept that there is a whole aspect, a whole non-physical aspect of our reality that absolutely cannot be denied, and that I could put that doubt behind me and move forward without the doubt. I'd like, healthy skepticism is always nice, but continuous significant doubt that's unwarranted is not helpful. Okay, so given all of that, I really wanted to take a closer look at reincarnation. So there's a gentleman by the name of Ian Stevenson who worked at University of Virginia and had a grant there, and the grant was to study reincarnation. So he started as a one-man band and eventually created a department that did that. And he eventually wrote a book called 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, which is kind of an understated way of saying, here's some proof. The book's been around a long time and is a classic, and highly recommended that you read it. And Stevenson is not this sort of wide-eyed person who just wants to believe these bizarre things. He's a very down-to-earth academic that is all about proof and skepticism. And but the more evidence he collected, the more he was convinced that this stuff was real. So there's a website that has this story, a bunch of background information, a couple of videos, videoed interviews, and I'll put that link on the summary page. But there was a bit of a story in there that I think was helpful to look at. Basically, what the journalist was saying was, imagine you have 100 people standing on the top of the Empire State Building. And one by one, each of these 100 people jumped off the Empire State Building. Of course, you would know what to expect. The results of jumping off the Empire State Building are rather obvious. But what would happen if 95 out of those 100 people ended up, of course, falling to their death, but 5 of them ended up landing and walking away? Would you spend time studying the 95 who fell to their death, or would you spend time studying the 5 who landed and walked away? Now, that seems like a silly question. Obviously, those 5 are of great interest. But the way science works in a lot of cases is science ends up throwing out anomalous data very often. And very often you'll hear comments like, oh, well, that data is an outlier. That's not reflective of anything meaningful. We're just going to throw that information away because the vast majority of data confirms this finding that that's interesting. Well, that's just silly. Throwing out data because it doesn't prove your point is simply not good science. But it happens all the time. This whole sort of data filtering, selective data analysis where this goes on. So really what I want to say is, does reincarnation happen every day? Does it happen universally? Does it happen to everybody? Maybe, maybe not. But what I will say is these stories are somewhat rare. I say somewhat rare. Maybe there's only a couple of thousand of these stories. In the big picture with the billions of people on Earth, maybe a couple of thousand stories isn't significant. But I think anyone would have to agree that a couple of thousand stories of the type that we're talking about are something that should not be ignored. So let's kind of look at these things as important data points and not as outlier data that ought to be thrown away. And I think once we do that, we're sort of heading down the right road. Okay, so I'd like to tell just a few stories, and just so you understand, I'm not going to try to get into incredible detail in each one of these stories because of our limited time. And but all of this information is easily available. All it takes is a little bit of time to go in and read the stories. The first one is about a girl named Swarnlata Mishra. This is a little girl that was born in India. And before we go any further, I'll just say that yes, of course, quite a few of these stories are from cultures that accept reincarnation. And actually, that's something that skeptics very, very often point to when they want to show why this is not really believable, because the only people who report it already believe in reincarnation. I'm not so sure that logic really holds. If the stories and the facts hold up, they hold up. I guess I would say in a culture that believes in reincarnation, the only sort of special thing that's going to go on is that people are not going to ignore the signs of reincarnation. Whereas in Western cultures, where this stuff is not really accepted, parents simply tell their child that they're just imagining things and they must have dreamt it or whatever, and they come up with a bunch of excuses. So this isn't a matter of these stories are being invented in India, therefore they're not believable. It's that in some cultures, these stories are acceptable and accepted, and people pay attention to these kinds of things. And in other cultures, they don't pay attention to them, so they're swept under the rug, or they're just simply ignored. And that's my 2 cents on that subject. Let's get back to the story. So this is girl Swarnlata Mishra, 3 years old, obviously very, very, very young child, is driving with her father and in a town in India. They were heading to get some tea, and they were in a town that they'd never been to before, and I forget why they went there. If you read the story, I'm sure it's all in the story. But the girl all of a sudden said, "Father, take this street down this way. We can go to my house, and the tea is much better there, and much better than we're going to be able to find anywhere else." The father sort of looked at her, and just for the heck of it, he went down the street that his daughter told him to go down. And as they were driving down this road, she explained that, she used to live in this house. She described the house. She described the people there. She described her name when she used to live there. She laid out a bunch of facts to her father. Her father, as I remember, may have been an academic, but he, in any case, he decided he should write this information down. He kind of felt like it was important, and he should write it down before they got to the house and before they started interacting with the people. I'm sure part of the reason he thought that is because, again, he's in a culture that believes in reincarnation, and so the folks that come across this have sort of been, or they're accustomed to documenting the facts before trying to validate the facts. So they arrive at the house, and not surprisingly, as they pulled up, she pointed to the house. It was exactly as she described. They went, they knocked on the door, they introduced themselves, they were invited in. Of course, they described the whole reincarnation story that the young child was telling. The child correctly identified the people in the house. At this point in time, she was only 3 years old, but her brothers and sisters were in their 20s at this point, and were still there in the house, and her parents were in, whatever, their 40s or 50s. But she knew her parents, she knew her brothers and sisters, she knew their nicknames. They had quite a long talk, they had their tea, they chatted, and that was the end of that. They went home, and, all was well. A few years later, a doctor found out about this story. I don't think it was Stevenson, I think it was some other doctor. Stevenson arrived on the scene later, and he looked up the father and the daughter, who was now 10, and he decided he wanted to do a little bit more detailed research. And so he actually found the town that this girl lived in her prior incarnation. He gathered a whole bunch of her original family together and set up essentially a meeting, a party. I guess it would be a meeting with her whole family. What he did is he actually introduced a bunch of strangers into this setting as well. So there were some of her family, cousins and whatnot, brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, and also a lot of strangers. And they actually went around to all these different people and asked the girl which one, at this point she was 10 years old, which one she recognized and didn't recognize, and had her provide whatever facts or background or information she could. And she correctly identified all of her family that were there, correctly identified little details that the only people that knew these details were the individual family member and her original incarnation, who was now dead. And she was correct on almost all the facts that she brought out. And when the doctor tried to fool her into thinking that some of these strangers were, people that she knew in her prior life, she correctly corrected him, told him that no, in fact, those people were strangers. So I guess that's probably the level of detail I would stop at. Like I said, this article, this is a whole chapter in Stevenson's book, and gets into a tremendous amount of detail. But just remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about a 3-year-old who is correctly identifying where she lived, her parents, her brothers and sisters, their names, and physical details about her house. And then later on, we're talking about a 10-year-old who did the same thing in terms of identifying people in her family. Not only that, there was a more subtle thing going on here, where people who were older than her when she was in her original incarnation, she had a certain demeanor with, a certain respectful demeanor. The interesting thing is, as a 10-year-old girl, she was talking to her children, who were now in their 30s. When she was taken off to the side and met with her children, she was talking to them as if she was the mother. So she didn't have that same respectful demeanor. She had a more authoritative demeanor, that of a parent of these children, even though these children were 20 years older than this little girl. That's not a factual, evidential kind of a thing, but I think is no less important. How would a 10-year-old child who grew up in a society where these level of respect for your elders is really an important part of that society, an important part of that culture, how would a child like that ignore those norms and behave that way? It's not conceivable. She wouldn't do it. So, pretty compelling story, right? And again, this is coming from a 3-year-old originally, and then a 10-year-old, and these are people that don't have a lot of reasons to lie. Okay, so that is the story from a girl from India. Well, let me go to another story. This is about a young boy named James Leininger, And many people have made this is a much more recent story. There's been articles and YouTubes and television shows, and I think a book written on this subject. It's about a little boy who, a couple of weeks or a few weeks after his second birthday, started having nightmares. And the nightmares involved his mother would come into the bedroom and he'd be screaming and try to talk him out of it. And the nightmares involved being in a fire and having fire, basically being consumed by fire. And as these nightmares went on, the mother spent more and more time talking to the child about it. And it turns out he dreamt that he was in an airplane and was shot in the front of the airplane with anti-aircraft fire, and the plane burned up and he crashed and he died. It was very, 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 very upsetting to the child. And over time, this went on for months. Over time, the child ended up really developing a real strong interest in aircraft, military aircraft, World War II military aircraft. So the mother would get books at the library and bring them home. And one time the little boy pointed at the plane and said, that plane right there, that's a Corsair. That's my favorite plane. And again, remember, this is a 2-year-old, right? That's my favorite plane. And they were talking about it, and I think he had said something along the lines of, I may be mixing up parts of the story, but he actually made some comments along the lines of there was problems with the landing gear and the way you'd land on an aircraft carrier with this landing gear, they would always get flat tires. The kid knew this. How he would know it, of course, is completely a mystery. And the mother pointed out as she was looking at the plane how interesting the plane was, and she was pointing at the bombs under the wings, and look at those bombs. They must have dropped those when on the enemy. And the boy scoffed at her and says, "Mom, those aren't bombs. Those are drop tanks. Those extend the range of the plane so that they can fly from an aircraft carrier to do their mission and be able to have enough fuel to get back. They would drop the tanks and be able to get back." Again, I remind you that we're talking about a 2-year-old here. It turns out, of course, that yes, in fact, those were drop tanks. And yes, in fact, there were problems with the landing gear on the particular plane that he was talking about. All of the facts that he brought up were absolutely true. So his stories continued. And first of all, he always referred to himself as James 3. And his parents couldn't figure that out because actually he is James Jr. And they would always explain that to him. And he goes, "No, I'm James 3. And of course, that never made any sense, but it makes sense in a minute. He told his mother and father a lot of stories about the fact that he was in Japan and he was working on an aircraft carrier and on a mission with the rest of his squadron. He was shot down over Japan and killed. The father ended up asking him what the name of the aircraft carrier was, and the little kid didn't hesitate at all. He goes, "It was called the Natoma." And the father did research, and yes, in fact, there was a carrier called the Natoma over there. And the father did a lot of research into the squadron that was there, the pilots that were there. And again, so James, the little boy, always referred to him as James 3. His name in his previous life, the pilot that was killed in the plane, he would refer to as James 2. So you got the pilot, it was James 2, and the little boy was James 3. Well, it turns out there was actually a pilot, James, and I really should have done my homework here and had the name of the pilot in front of me, but I don't. I'm just going to say, I'm going to use his last name being Smith here, just for as a filler. There was a pilot named James Smith Jr. who was on the Natoma and was flying these aircraft and did die in a sortie over Japan. So all these facts started to piece together. Long story into a short, the father ended up finding at a reunion, I think, a reunion event for the Natoma pilots, and there were a few left at that time. This I think happened just recently, in the last 15 years. This little story came out. So these pilots were pretty old, but they attended this reunion, and the son actually got a chance to reunite with some of these pilots and tell war stories. And it turns out that the way the son was describing the sortie and the way the son was describing the Japanese attack that killed him was confirmed by the other pilots. He was in fact shot head on by anti-aircraft fire, and the plane did explode into flames and go down, which is exactly as the boy described. They even found the boy's sister, and they got her together with the boy, and of course the sister was, I think, probably in her 80s at this point. Meeting with this little boy who at this point was maybe 3 years old. But the little boy knew exactly about their life together, details about where they lived, their bedrooms, etc. And the sister was convinced this was actually her brother. Yes, a skeptic would say, well, she just wanted to believe that was her brother, and that's fine. Skeptics can say whatever they want, but if you read the story and you see the factual, evidential aspects of the story, you'll see that it's way, way, way beyond coincidence. So that's the story of James Leininger. You'll notice he's not from India; he's from the United States, but he has a pretty compelling story here in terms of his belief in the fact that he was reincarnated. And of course, as you may have gathered, this pilot, and I'm calling him James Smith III Jr. The reason little James was calling himself James III instead of James II was because he believes that he is the next James after James Smith Jr. And so he, in his mind, is the third James and not the second James. All right. There's a recent book titled The Boy Who Knew Too Much, and I won't go into a lot of the details. I just want to give another example of a reincarnation story that's happened very recently. This is in the last, I think, 10 years, of a little boy, again, and this little boy was 2 years old, who believed he used to be tall and used to play baseball. He was tall like Dad, and he used to play baseball. And he lived in Los Angeles with his family, and so his family just thought, and he always wanted to be in his baseball uniform. That's the only thing he would wear, is a Los Angeles Dodgers uniform. And of course, they wondered who the baseball player was, and they assumed it was a Dodger. And they asked him if it was a Los Angeles Dodger, and of course, his first thing was, well, the Dodgers weren't in Los Angeles back then. They were in New York, which this is a 2-year-old. How would he even know that? But he says, no, it was the other New York team. It was the Yankees that he played for. And one thing led to another, and the mother, again, this is classic, the parents would go get books of pictures and just to try to help the child sort of figure this stuff out. And the child ended up pointing to a person in the picture, and that person was Lou Gehrig. And he goes, that's me. And it turns out that, I won't get into a lot of the details of the book, but I didn't realize that there was a lot of animosity between Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth. But when this little boy was pointing at the picture, he goes, that's me. And that man there is mean. I don't like him. He's not a nice man. And he was pointing to Babe Ruth. He didn't even know who really Babe Ruth was at the time. He certainly didn't recognize him. Turns out, as the whole story came together, Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth actually did have a lot of animosity. They actually were... Babe Ruth actually lived with the Gehrigs for a while, and there was some issues with regard to Babe Ruth hitting on Lou Gehrig's wife and causing a real problem in their relationship. And this little 2-year-old boy knew all about this, which of course is just patently impossible. Turns out the story is interesting because it turns out the mother in the story, the little boy's mother, was also his mother in the previous incarnation. She was actually Mrs. Gehrig, and she went and had a past life regression and ended up learning a lot. She ended up remembering a lot about being the boy's mother, about being Lou Gehrig's mother, and details about their life. And these details were confirmed when they went to New York to the Gehrig's original homestead. Of course, they didn't live there anymore. Other people lived there, but they ended up going into the house and recognizing different aspects of the house and whatnot. So not only was the boy convinced that he had lived a life as Lou Gehrig, but the mother found out that she didn't remember this, but found out after the fact that she had been the boy's mother in that previous life. Very interesting. So the book, that book title is "The Boy Who Knew Too Much." So there we are. There's three reincarnation stories, and if you read the actual stories, the number of facts that validate the story are incredible. Dozens and dozens of facts in each one of these cases that validate the story. These things can't be ignored. These things shouldn't be ignored. These things are important. To me, given the evidence that I've found, and that is easily sufficient for me to accept that reincarnation is a real thing and that there is some non-physical aspect to our reality where that underlies the world that we live in. And the reason I say that, well, there's lots and lots of reasons, but one of the principal reasons, and I've talked about this in an earlier unit, is where did the information exist in a lot of these situations? Where did the information exist between the time that the original person died and the time that the new person was born? The new person was born with a lot of information in their mind, in their memory, in their mind, in their brain, wherever you want to say that exists. But that new child, that 2-year-old, that 3-year-old, remembered things that couldn't possibly be remembered because the information was destroyed when the original person died, right? That information is long gone. Where did it exist for those intervening decades? Well, it must exist in something that isn't physical. And I just refer to that whole sort of aspect of our reality as the non-physical. It exists somewhere in the non-physical aspect of our reality. So, again, to me, there's enough information here that gets me over the hump. There's enough information here where I am convinced that this aspect of our world is absolutely valid and I can stop doubting it. Now I need to just move forward and see what other kinds of phenomena exist and what kinds of things those phenomena prove. And really, my whole intention in this whole process is to look at enough aspects of our reality, enough aspects that talk to the non-physical aspect of our reality, so that I can put the pieces together and understand how it all works. To some degree. I don't think any one of us is ever going to fully understand how all of this works. I don't think we as humans probably have the intellectual capacity to understand it. Any more than a virus in the bloodstream of an astronaut understands what's going on around it. Does that virus understand that it's in a space shuttle and that it's on its way to the International Space Station? Of course it can't. Not only does it not have the data to provide it that much to provide the information, the background information to it, but it doesn't have the intellectual capacity to even understand that data. And I guess what I'm saying is, we as humans, I'm quite sure that we don't have the intellectual capacity to really understand how reality works. But I guess I want to understand as much as it's possible for me to understand. And the only way to do that is to investigate and try to connect the dots. So that's what we're doing here. So, that's reincarnation. I'd like to also talk about mediumship here. So let's start with some of the basics. People have heard the term medium, and they've also heard the term psychic, and they've heard the term psychic medium. And so let's just start by defining the difference between psychic and medium. There really is a difference. Psychics are people that have a gift for understanding more about you than they should be able to understand. Not only about you, your past, your present, and even your future. They will tell you things like, there's going to be a wedding. Something like, you used to live on the West Coast and now you live on the East Coast. Something like, there's going to be a big event next September, right? They'll be telling you things like that. And unfortunately, most psychic readings that I've read about and heard about leave me pretty flat. Most of this stuff is very, very subjective. Most of this stuff people can read into it whatever they want to read into it. And so it leaves me pretty unconvinced. I would say a lot of people who, skeptical people, even sort of what I would refer to as healthy skeptics, end up just basically, looking at the psychic, typical psychic reading evidence and just dismiss it. And I don't blame them at all. I believe that this stuff is probably true and probably valid, but it just is not evidential enough to be able to draw hard conclusions. And you'll find that most scientific investigations into this phenomena, into this type of phenomenon, they're going to tend more towards mediumship, and I'm going to define that in a minute, and less towards pure psychic kind of a reading. Okay, so that's what psychics do. Mediums are different. Mediums are people who have a gift to actually be able to communicate with deceased people, right? And so it's very specific. They are a medium. They are a connection between someone the term that they use in the studies are, you have a sitter, who is the person who wants to have the reading. You have the medium, who is providing the reading, and then you've got the discarnate, who is actually talking to the medium, right? So the medium is kind of a switchboard, where they're, on one hand, they've got the sitter who wants information, on the other hand, they've got the person who has died who is providing the information, and they're really sitting in the middle. And sometimes it gets really odd. Sometimes these people take on weird affectations, weird accents, even speak in other languages, really kind of odd. Very often they go into a trance. If people refer to themselves as a trance medium, they'll go into some sort of an odd trance. In other cases, the medium won't be in a trance at all. They'll be perfectly lucid, perfectly awake, and perfectly conversant. These skills that people attain seem to vary in terms of how they work. Some people end up scribbling with a piece of paper, a pen and paper. Other people end up being, as I said, in only semi-lucid, in a bit of a trance state. It varies widely. But in all cases, the medium is interfacing between a person who is deceased and a person who is alive, and moving information back and forth. There are some mediums that refer to themselves as veridical mediums, and veridical simply meaning gathering evidence. Veridical and evidential, maybe you could use as synonyms. So one thing about a veridical medium is one of their whole goals is to give you enough factual evidence, enough points that you can go and check on to verify the validity of what you're saying, right? Having a medium say, "Gee, I've got your father here. He died, and he's saying that he loves you." There's nothing veridical about that. But having the medium say, "I've got your father here. He died. He's saying I love you, and he's saying, remember that little green teddy bear I gave you on your 10th birthday? Why did you stuff it in the attic in a box?" Right? That kind of thing happens all the time, right? And the living person obviously remembers those facts, but the medium has no idea about this information. It does turn out occasionally, I would say more than occasionally, I would say in most readings, the medium will say something along the lines of what I just said. How about that green teddy bear? And the person getting the reading won't connect with it, won't understand what they're talking about. So that's a case where the medium doesn't know about the green teddy bear. The person getting the reading doesn't know about the green teddy bear. But very often that person who's getting the reading goes back and talks with their brother or their sister or their mother or their father or whoever. Not their father, because their father died in this case. But they'll go verify it, and they'll end up coming back to the medium saying, "I know exactly what my father was talking about. Yes, I did have a green teddy bear. I forgot all about it, but my sister reminded me. And, here's the teddy bear," right? So that goes back to, I believe, some of the most compelling evidence for trusting this whole process is when the person being read and the person doing the reading neither one of those two knew the information that the deceased person provided. And it was determined after the fact that it was accurate information. That's when things really start to look very interesting. So that's a difference between a medium, a psychic medium, evidential medium. How does the medium get this information? Well, there's multiple different types of mediumship, and I've already described some of them, but there's also multiple different methods that they gain their information. And almost everyone's heard of the term clairvoyance. Clairvoyance literally means to be able to see without your eyes, right? And there's also something called clairaudience, which means to be able to hear without your ears. And there's clairsentience, which means to be able to know without actually, for no reason, to know information for no reason. So there's clairaudience, there's other kinds of powers as well, but the primary ones are clairvoyance, clairaudience, and clairsentience. And various mediums use various of these methods to gain access to the discarnate entities. It's interesting, in living our world, vision is one of the most important senses to us. It's the way to gather the most information most easily is vision. But it turns out for mediums, at least in my opinion, the best way to gather information is actually clairaudience. Think about communicating to another person in your family. Do you do that visually? Well, yeah, there's a little bit of visual communication. But the primary method of communications for humans is speaking, right? And so the person the medium who uses clairaudience will be able to get the most definitive information from the deceased. Now, that doesn't change the fact that there are mediums out there that get visual information or pure sentient information. Clairaudient, to me, seems to be the most powerful of the medium processes. So that's how they get their information. I mean, literally, a clairaudient medium will hear that voice, and then some say it actually literally sounds like they're hearing it in their ear. They'll say, "I heard in my right ear such and such," and it sounds exactly like a voice that you would hear normally. Others say, "It's a voice, but I know I wasn't hearing it through my ears. I know it was more direct." But that depends on the medium, and it depends on the situation. So we talked about vertical mediums. We covered that. Cold readings. So what's a cold reading? Well, a lot of people who are skeptical about mediums and about psychics as well always talk about the idea of a cold reading. And a cold reading is essentially where the medium kind of throws out a bit of information, watches for body language, listens for responses, and then adjusts what they're saying based on what how the person responded. And it's been shown that you can take someone who isn't a medium at all, who is simply a huckster, a trickster, con artist, and they can look very much like a medium. The person sitting there getting the reading doesn't understand that they're being played. And so most people who are skeptics, especially skeptic of mediums, that's what they believe is going on in most cases, is that a cold reading is happening and that the medium isn't a medium at all. They're simply very, very skilled at getting information out of somebody. So that's what a cold reading is. Well, so when science started to do research into mediums, they obviously understood this whole thing called cold readings. And so they started to create procedures where cold readings wouldn't be possible. And some of these things they're called blind or double-blind experiments. And these are cases where the medium has never met the person being read, doesn't know their name, and vice versa. The person who's being read has never met the medium, never spoken with them. And so they really kind of get into blind kinds of situations where there's never been a connection between these two. Because then some skeptics will say, well, when the person registered on the website to get a reading, there's an email address and a name and a location, and I'm Jake from Boston, and here's my email address. I want to make an appointment to get a reading. Well, maybe that medium could take that information and do research. Yes, of course they could. But there's been lots and lots of tests where what's happened is people have been registered by third parties. So I will register my friend, Fred, and I will go on and I will register Fred. So the medium won't know Fred's name, won't know Fred's location, phone number, email address, or anything. So there will be no way for that medium to be able to do any prior research. Researchers have even gone further than that. They have, for example, they have done situations where there's a dummy sitter. So instead of me setting up an appointment for Fred to go get a reading, once Fred gets in front of the medium, you could still say that the medium could look for body language and kind of figure out something about Fred just by looking at him, the way he's dressed and the way he looks and the way he acts. Well, so researchers have set up. First of all, they set up rooms where the medium can't even see Fred, right? And so you can't look at Fred and draw any conclusions. But they've even gone further than that. And what they do is, for Fred to get the reading, I would actually go and I would actually sit for Fred to get the reading, and I would explain that I'm here for my friend to get a reading, and the medium would give the reading, and somewhere, somehow, in some non-physical aspect of our reality, the knowledge of the fact that Fred is a different person, and the reading would actually be directed to Fred and not to me, even though I'm the person sitting in front of the medium, right? There's lots of readings that get done over the phone right now, so you can't see the person being read. All I'm really trying to explain here is that for people who believe that you can explain these amazing mediums, you can explain it simply by the fact that they're doing a cold reading. These are people who haven't looked at the facts. Skeptics who say that haven't looked at the facts. They're talking about mediumship the way it was done 100 years ago. Mediumship isn't really done that way anymore. Well, particularly in a research environment. If you're just someone who goes to a medium and you want a reading, they're not going to put up all these protocols and to try to create dummy readings for dummy sitters, etc., etc. It's just not worth the effort. The point is, in situations where they're trying to study the validity of mediumship, they have done all these things, and guess what? They have shown that the readings are valid, and that they actually in many of these cases, they have a control group and then their test group. And so they'll do readings for the control group where, well, I'm not going to get into the details of how this all works. So the point is they can basically compare what an average reading would be if you were not a medium at all, if you were just guessing, and and then what the reading actually was for this person who was done by a medium. And they compare the two statistically, and it's been proven thousands and thousands of times that the reading given by an actual medium for a sitter is much, much more evidential and valid than the control group, which means that there's something going on here. All right? So I guess what I wanted to make clear is that mediumship is without a doubt been scientifically proven, and certainly reincarnation, to my satisfaction, has been proven as well. So if people don't believe that, it's usually because they're not aware of the facts. It's usually because they're dealing with just very, very surface level, minimal information about how this stuff is done. Really hasn't taken a close look at this. I've provided some links in my resources guide so that you can go to some websites, take a look at the kinds of actual studies and protocols that have been used to validate this work so that you can satisfy yourself that it is in fact real. All right? I'll just give you one more story about a medium that I went to. I've been to a couple of mediums. And I bet you people sitting here in this class, I bet you a significant percentage have gone to mediums as well. So I went to a medium, and the medium told me all kinds of things about my father. I see an older man. I think he's your father. who wants to speak with you, etc., etc. And she shared a bunch of different facts with me. For example, she said he smells like cigarette smoke. I think he was a heavy smoker. Yes, he was. Is that stunning? No, there's lots of heavy smokers that are here at his age, so it doesn't really mean too much. But there were a bunch of other facts, but the one that was the most compelling for me, she goes, right now, this is towards the end of the reading, she goes, right now, your father is standing beside you, but he's doing something very odd. And I go, what's that? She goes, he's got your head in his arm like this, and he's rubbing the top of your head. And she goes, what's that? And it was really amazing because my father was kind of a big bear of a guy and was very physical in terms of, the people he loved. And one thing that he did, and he did it not to everybody, but the people that were closest to him, he would grab them in a headlock and he'd rub the top of their heads and go, ah, like this, and kind of just physically abuse them a little bit. And I found that pretty incredible because it's sort of an odd thing to do out of what was absolutely in character for my father, and he did it to me many, many times. So that was huge. The other thing that the medium did was she said, there's this other older man, very similar to your father. He looks similar age, similar everything, and he's standing off to the side smiling, and he's surrounded by flowers, and he's offering you flowers. And it turns out that my father had a couple of brothers, and one brother was very much like him, looked like him, same size as him. I think they were within 1 year of each other, and he was a florist. That's what he did for a living. That was my Uncle Dick. So I thought that was pretty incredible that this other person that died wanted to say hello, wanted to offer me flowers, looked just like my father but was not my father, was my Uncle Dick, who was a florist. So pretty incredible. I think most people in most families, if they haven't had a reading by a medium, probably they have a family member or a close friend who has. And I'd be willing to bet that there's stories right now in this room of people who have had readings that learned some incredible things. And I guess what I wanted to this whole lecture series is all about taking these phenomena one by one, taking a close look at them, see where they're valid and see what they mean. And I guess what I want to do is put a little check mark beside mediumship and reincarnation and go, yup, that stuff is valid. Okay? And we're going to be doing a lot more, talking about a lot more phenomenon, but I think this is the first one that we've really covered, which really requires a bit of a leap of faith. But it's not really a leap of faith. All you really need to be is honest with yourself and open to accept the evidence and make a good objective decision as to whether that evidence is valid and whether it proves anything. To me, there's no doubt in my mind. Mediumship, are all mediums real? Absolutely not. But just like those 100 people who jumped off the Empire State Building, right? 95 of them hit the ground and went splat. 5 of them didn't. And rather than make a big deal out of that one medium or that group of mediums that are just charlatans, right? Rather than focus our attention on that, let's focus on the many, even the few. It doesn't matter whether it's a majority or not. Focus on those ones that are absolutely valid and that are absolutely providing valid information and that science can't refute. Don't spend the time saying, see, I found a cheat out there. He's not a real medium. Why waste your time? Why waste your time about those 95 people who went splat? Take a look at the 5 who didn't. That proves something. It's the old black swan story that most people have probably heard of. Just because you find thousands and thousands and thousands of white swans doesn't prove there isn't a black one. All you got to do is find one black one and you've proved your point. And the same thing is true with a lot of these paranormal and metaphysical kinds of skills. Yes, there's a lot of charlatans out there. Yes, there are a few liars and tricksters out there. But if you can find a few that are absolutely valid, that's all that's necessary to be able to prove the point that there's an underlying non-physical aspect to the world we live in. All right? So, Next unit is unit number 8, and we're going to talk about looking behind the veil. This mediumship unit that we're just finishing up showed us that there's a whole aspect of the world that we can't see. The mediums can see it, but we can't. The next unit is going to talk about how we can actually look behind the veil, where we can start seeing some of these things that are in the non-physical. All right? So until then, hope you have a nice day.